Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to the Ming Dynasty, roughly 600 years ago, where your job is, unfortunately, government paperwork. You're a tax clerk in a world without calculators, caffeine, or weekends, and your handwriting might decide whether a village eats next year. You probably won't survive this bureaucracy, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me your location and the time you're listening. I love seeing how far these sleepy travels reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rooster outside your window has been awake for hours, but you've been awake longer. The first light seeps through the paper lattice, illuminating ink stains that look like tiny mountain ranges across your desk. Your brush lies beside a half-dry inkstone, blackened with yesterday's arithmetic. You rub the stick again, slow, circular, until the scent of pine soot rises like incense. The act is almost meditative, if not for the thought of another day of ledgers. You stretch, joints clicking like old abacuses, and tie your faded indigo robe. Outside, the courtyard glows pale gray. Somewhere a cook stirs millet porridge for the magistrate's breakfast. You, however, are lower on the pyramid, comfortably above the peasants, dangerously below everyone else. You shovel down a bowl of rice left from last night, cold and clumpy, then gather your writing kit, brush, seal, tally sticks, and that eternal enemy, the ledger book swollen with humidity. By sunrise, the office drum will beat, and your superior expects your daily inventory of grain tax receipts. 1,000 sacks of rice, give or take a few mysterious disappearances. You remember yesterday's argument with the granary keeper, who swore the missing weight was when shrinkage. You suspect mice, very well-fed mice. You step outside. The cobblestones sweat with morning dew, and the air smells faintly of wet clay and boiled tea. In the distance, the river murmurs, the artery that carries both tribute rice and rumors. The world around you feels deceptively peaceful. The Ming bureaucracy, as historians still argue, was either a marvel of organization or a slow-moving monster made of paper and paranoia. Its records could outlast dynasties, yet its workers like you age twice as fast trying to keep them perfect. Mainstream fact: the Ming tax system relied heavily on grain collection, tons upon tons hauled from villages to regional storehouses, measured by wooden buckets and registered down to the last handful. You check your brush points again. The ink feels smooth now, eager. It's almost poetic. Almost. You test a few strokes on scrap paper, drawing characters so familiar they feel like muscle memory. Rice, silver, arrears, punishment. All the sweet vocabulary of your existence. Someone coughs beyond the courtyard wall. That's old Liu, the gatekeeper, announcing he's awake and still underpaid. He's already unfurling the flag of the yamen, the official banner marking the county office. Its fabric snaps lazily in the morning breeze. The red dye faded into rust. You bow slightly out of habit. Even cloth deserves respect when it represents the emperor. A young assistant rushes in with today's roll call tablet. He trips over a broom and pretends he didn't. You note his hair's tied lopsided and his robe is inside out. Bureaucratic chic. The magistrate's already reading petitions, he pants. You thank him and head out. Ledger tucked under your arm like a reluctant pet. Crossing the courtyard, you pass a row of other clerks muttering over documents. One sneezes directly onto an account scroll and sighs, "Heaven forgive me, I'll have to rewrite the entire year." You nod solemnly. You both know heaven will not interfere in clerical matters. At the granary gates, the smell hits first. Rice dust, mildew, and the faint metallic tang of spilled copper coins. A line of peasants already waits, each with a sack balanced on their backs. Their faces are weary but resigned. Tax day is as predictable as sunrise. You mark their entries one by one, comparing weights, scribbling notes, and stamping receipts. The bamboo tallies clatter pleasantly, a small percussion to your morning. One man swears his grain was blessed by the village priest and therefore counts double. You admire the creativity but mark one sack anyway. Another insists his family donated 2 ducks last year and should be credited. You smile politely. You're not authorized for poultry rebates. Quirky tidbit. Ming officials sometimes use tribute curiosities as partial payment. Strange goods like exotic feathers or medicinal roots, whenever standard grain was scarce. Somewhere in some archive, a tax ledger probably lists 2 jars of pickled frogs as legal tender. By mid-morning, sweat pearls on your neck. You fan yourself with a scrap of paper that turns out to be an unfiled petition. You pretend not to notice. Bureaucracy, after all, is 70% paperwork and 30% pretending not to see things. At last, the carts are unloaded, the weights recorded, and you seal the day's first ledger. The wax cools unevenly, forming a lump that resembles the province itself, misshapen, weary, and somehow still holding together. You sign your name with a flourish that only half hides the ink blot beneath. A bell rings in the distance, signal for the Yamen gate to open officially. You glance at the sun, not even mid-morning. Perfect. 12 more hours to go. You tuck your ledger under your arm, brush the dust off your robe, and murmur the unofficial motto of every Ming clerk. May the emperor's rice never mildew, and may my ink never run out. You take a breath, steady and slow. Another day begins. Another round of numbers pretending to be justice. By the time the morning bell fades, the Yamen courtyard hums with the rhythm of routine. Brushes scratching, sandals scuffing, someone sneezing into an official scroll. You step inside the main hall, that cavernous chamber of polished cedar beams and faint incense haze. The magistrate's bench looms ahead, framed by red banners that proclaim eternal loyalty to the emperor. You suspect the banners have seen more dust than devotion lately. Your desk sits under a leaky corner of the roof, an architectural metaphor if there ever was one. Rain drips sometimes, right into your inkstone, which you now cover with a broken tile. Resourcefulness, the clerk's unofficial art form. You open the ledgers again and inhale that familiar blend of mold and bureaucracy. Every page is a battlefield of tiny characters, your soldiers in a war against disorder. The other clerks murmur nearby, voices blending with the creak of bamboo blinds. Someone complains about grain receipts from the western village arriving too light. Another claims the tax runners have been bribed with dumplings again. Historians still argue whether Ming taxation corruption was endemic or simply an accepted lubricant in the machine. You think it's both, survival wrapped in etiquette. Mainstream fact, Ming officials were rotated through posts every few years to reduce local alliances and bribes. But the system mostly ensured no one knew what they were doing long enough to fix it. The tax codes, beautiful in theory, could fill an ox cart. You, meanwhile, can't even fill a teapot without counting it toward expenses. Mid-morning brings visitors, peasants with petitions, merchants seeking leniency. Even a Buddhist monk arguing that spiritual contributions should be tax-exempt. You envy his confidence. The magistrate sighs theatrically, waves his fan, and assigns you to review the documentation, which means you, alone, again. You retreat behind a folding screen painted with cranes, symbols of longevity, irony fully intended, and sort through the day's receipts. The first packet is tied with straw string, damp from river travel. You untie it carefully because wet rice paper tears like gossip. The numbers blur together. You blink hard until they behave. Somewhere in the stacks you find an entry marked in red. Surplus unaccounted, possibly due to celestial misfortune. You underline it twice and add a note. Recommend less astrology, more arithmetic. Lunch arrives in a lacquer box, courtesy of the magistrate's cook. Lukewarm rice, pickled turnips, and a slab of tofu that might once have been enthusiastic about living. You eat while reading a new imperial edict pinned to the wall. It announces yet another simplification of tax categories. Last time, simplification meant renaming everything. You suspect this one will too. A quirky tidbit: some county clerks use poetic shorthand to record taxes, tiny verse codes like moonlight over 3 hills, meaning 3 households paid in full. The result? Future archivists could read your ledgers as either financial records or very bad poetry. Afternoon heat thickens the air. A fly lands on your brush handle and refuses to leave, so you name him Assistant Inspector. He's less troublesome than most inspectors you've met. You record another dozen transactions before your eyes start crossing. The magistrate calls for tea, and you are summoned to summarize the quarter's intake. You bring the ledger, carefully balanced like an offering bowl, and kneel before his dais. He fans himself lazily. "So, clerk," he says, "how prospers our province?" You recite numbers like a prayer: grain yields, copper tallies, arrears pending. His eyelids droop halfway through miscellaneous assessments. When you finish, he yawns, nods, and says, "Excellent. Submit the duplicates to the prefecture by next month." By next month means yesterday. You bow and retreat, your knees cracking louder than decorum allows. Back at your desk, you begin copying the ledgers by hand, a process that could drive saints to profanity. Each column must match the last down to the brushstroke. 1 smudge and you'll rewrite the page. 2 smudges and you'll rewrite your career. The repetition becomes hypnotic. Your brush glides through numbers and names until they stop feeling like people and start sounding like rainfall. Outside, thunder rumbles faintly. A summer storm creeps over the horizon, and the clerk beside you mutters, "Good, maybe lightning will strike the tax warehouse." You both laugh quietly, the laughter of people who know divine intervention won't risk an audit. Evening settles slowly, gold light leaking between rafters. The rain begins, soft then insistent, drumming on the roof like 1,000 impatient officials. You tilt your head back, let the rhythm fill the silence. For a moment, bureaucracy feels almost beautiful. Its monotony steady as the rain, its futility oddly comforting. You close the ledger, seal it with a sigh, and mark the day complete. Another column balanced, another invisible victory. Somewhere beyond the storm, an empire sleeps, trusting you to keep its rice counted and its paper dry. By dawn, the rain has rinsed the rooftops clean and left the world smelling faintly of wet dust and bean paste. You drag yourself back to the office courtyard, still clutching the ledgers wrapped in oiled paper. They're heavy, not because of weight, but because of the sheer authority they pretend to hold. Inside those pages lie the province's entire digestive system. Rice in, silver out, complaints everywhere in between. The junior clerks shuffle in like ghosts after a night of cheap wine and existential dread. One tries to re-ink a broken brush by dipping it into his sleeve. You pretend not to notice. Solidarity among the half-paid. The magistrate hasn't arrived yet, which means there's still time to pretend productivity. You unroll the latest decree from the capital, printed in dense black characters that glisten like beetle shells. It announces a harmonization of land tax quotas. You grin wryly. In bureaucratic language, harmonization means everyone will argue for weeks about what it means. Historians still argue whether the Ming state used confusion as an intentional management tool. You personally believe it's just an occupational hazard of running an empire on ink and optimism. Mainstream fact: the Ming Dynasty employed an estimated 30,000 clerks across China, maintaining ledgers so detailed that modern scholars use them to reconstruct crop yields and population patterns centuries later. Yet not one of those clerks ever got a statue. You wonder if that's justice or just efficiency. Mid-morning brings the grain measurers. Two men carrying a wooden bucket the size of a small bathtub. They argue about calibration, about whose stick is more imperially sanctioned. You settle it by citing last month's memorandum and threatening to send both to recheck the granary's scales. They bow, grumble, and shuffle away, leaving behind the smell of mildew and pride. You take a break in the courtyard, sipping watered tea while watching pigeons debate rooftops. Your mind drifts to home, a narrow alley behind the tea house district, where your landlord's cat guards the stairway like a minor deity. The memory makes you smile until you recall the rent due in 3 days. That wipes it clean. Quirky tidbit: Ming-era officials sometimes paid rent in candles or firewood, leading to a black market in light taxes. Somewhere someone's wealth was literally measured in leftover wax. You wish your landlord would accept melted accounting mistakes as currency. Back inside, a messenger arrives from the prefectural capital. He's drenched, mud streaked up to his knees, but still manages a bow sharp enough to slice tofu. He hands over a sealed document. You break the wax and find the dreaded phrase, "Immediate verification of arrears." In other words, the provincial auditor's coming. Soon, the office reacts like a kicked anthill. Clerks scramble to tidy piles of scrolls that haven't been touched since last harvest. Someone starts burning incense to ward off paperwork demons. You decide to join him, purely for morale. Afternoon heat turns the air syrup thick. You sort through receipts, double-checking weights and names. The pages whisper with dry friction, each line a potential accusation. You find one entry, Village of White Bamboo, showing tribute 2 sacks short. You frown, knowing the auditor will pounce on it like a hawk. Maybe those sacks vanish to feed the local soldiers. Maybe someone's cousin. Either way, you'll be the one explaining. You draft a polite footnote. Possible misrecording due to flooding. Flooding, you've learned, is a universal excuse. It covers everything from bad math to divine intervention. The magistrate finally returns from his nap disguised as meditation. "Everything in order?" he asks, stretching like a satisfied cat. You hand him the summary scroll and bow. He skims it for 5 seconds, nods solemnly and says, "Excellent, send it to the prefecture." You wonder if he ever reads the words or simply senses the desperation in the handwriting. By evening, the sky dims to a bruised lilac. The river below the wall gleams like a moving mirror. You linger by the window, staring at your reflection, ink smudged on the cheek, eyes grainy from counting other people's grain. The faint scent of lamp oil fills the room as you light a wick, watching the flame steady itself. For all the monotony, there's something strangely noble in it, keeping the invisible wheels turning, ensuring that farmers' sweat becomes empire stability. Or at least that's what you tell yourself when sleep doesn't come easily. You seal the day's packet of documents, tie it with hemp cord and mark it ready for audit. You whisper to the wax seal, "Be kind, old friend." Then you place it on the shelf beside 100 others, identical, anonymous, immortal. Outside, thunder grumbles again. Maybe the gods are still displeased with the arithmetic of mortals. Maybe they're just bored. You close the shutters and let the darkness fold in like a blanket, the day dissolving into quiet ink. The next morning breaks through the haze with a sharp light that has no mercy for tired eyes or sloppy bookkeeping. You arrive before the others, partly out of duty, mostly because sleep evicted you early. The courtyard's stone tiles glisten with dew, and the bamboo by the well sways lazily in the damp breeze. Somewhere, a rooster realizes it's late for work and starts shouting about it. Inside, the air smells of smoke, ink, and faint despair. You unroll yesterday's bundle of tax ledgers, ready for another round of bureaucratic endurance training. The pages are slightly warped from humidity, your oldest enemy, besides arithmetic. The first task, calculate the grain owed by the Western District's farmers. The formula is simple. Total acreage times yield estimate minus flood deduction plus surcharges for imperial rituals. You sigh. The imperial rituals column is basically an elegant way of saying, we need extra rice because the emperor's palace staff got hungry. The first historical fact of the day, Ming taxation was mostly paid in kind, grain, silk, or labor, until the 1580s when the infamous single whip reform converted everything into silver. You're a century early for that luxury, which means your day still depends on counting bags of rice like it's treasure. You start marking entries with a bamboo tally stick, 1 stroke per sack. It's monotonous, hypnotic, almost meditative, until the ink blotches. A tiny blob of black spreads over a villager's name, turning Lee Family Farm into Ink Monster Estate. You mutter a curse under your breath and dab it uselessly with a sleeve. The universe smirks. Outside, a cart rattles in, its wheels squealing like gossiping old women. 2 peasants hop down, their tunics plastered with mud, each hauling a sack that could hide a small elephant. "Tax delivery," one yells as if announcing salvation. You inspect the bags. They smell faintly of mildew and regret. You weigh them on the office scale, an iron contraption older than your magistrate's morals. The readings don't match the receipts. Of course they don't. You squint, tapping the weight beam, pretending you can fix physics with confidence. Historians still argue whether Ming officials were underpaid to encourage creative honesty. You can confirm the theory feels plausible. You decide to adjust the entry just a little, enough to make it balance without starting a provincial inquest. A small mercy, you tell yourself. After all, everyone cheats the state in moderation. That's how civilization stays polite. By noon, the sun has cooked the courtyard into a shimmering pot of air soup. You eat lunch, cold millet and pickled turnip, while listening to the other clerks complain about hemorrhoids and handwriting. Someone jokes about transferring to the capital. Everyone laughs like it's a ghost story. Quirky tidbit: the Ming capital's bureaucrats were rumored to suffer a condition called ink madness, brought on by years of copying imperial decrees in micro handwriting. Symptoms included spontaneous weeping and quoting Confucius to furniture. You glance at your desk and swear you see it nodding in sympathy. After lunch, the prefect's aide arrives, a man so polished he squeaks when he walks. His robes shimmer teal and gold. His hair bound in a knot so perfect it might have its own administrative rank. He delivers a message from the prefect himself. The emperor demands faster tax collection. Delays will not be tolerated. The aide smiles like a cat who just explained how fire works. You bow, promise diligence, and hide the urge to ask if the emperor plans to personally count the rice. The aide leaves in a swirl of silk, probably to ruin someone else's day next. Afternoon brings thunderheads. You step outside just in time to feel the first fat drops splatter across your forehead. Farmers hurry to cover their carts. Children squeal as the rain hits the clay street. It's one of those tropical downpours that arrives like divine correction. Fast, loud, and unnegotiable. You rush to save the ledgers from another watery apocalypse, stacking them on shelves above the floodline. As the rain roars against the roof, the sound merges with the rhythmic tapping of dripping bamboo. You close your eyes for a moment, just listening. In that white noise, the empire feels far away, almost gentle. Maybe history, you think, is just weather in slow motion. When the storm finally retreats, the air smells sharper, metallic. You return to your seat, mop the table, and resume writing. The candlelight flickers over the inkstone, the shadow of your brush looping across the page like a tired crane in flight. You finish the day's tallies and glance at the long scroll of numbers. Each column tells a story. Drought, deceit, survival. None of them mention you, but your fingerprints are everywhere in the margins, like faint proof of life. As twilight folds over the compound, a fellow clerk hums an off-key tune about tax gods and miscounted chickens. You find yourself joining in, softly, your laughter echoing between the ledger stacks, because somehow in the smallest acts of accuracy and absurdity, the empire endures. Morning creeps in, pale and fog-heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything, sky, ground, people, blur into one long sigh. You shuffle through the main gate with the rest of the clerks, each of you clutching your brushes like nervous talismans. The watchman yawns and stamps the attendance board with the same enthusiasm as a turtle filing tax forms. Today's agenda, pinned to the wall, reads, Inventory reconciliation of provincial storehouses. You stare at it for a moment, as if by glaring hard enough you can make it disappear. No luck. The phrase alone feels like a threat wrapped in formality. You gather your measuring tools, a bamboo rod, an abacus, a small knife for cutting grain cords, and, because experience has taught you well, a flask of bitter tea. As you step out toward the grain depot, the smell of damp earth and fermented rice fills the air. Somewhere nearby, a mule brays in existential protest. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Ming Dynasty's provincial storehouses were crucial to its survival, functioning like emergency banks for food. During famine or flood, the empire opened these vaults of rice to feed the people, or, more cynically, to prevent rebellion before tax season ended. The storehouse looms at the river's edge, a massive block of gray stone with iron-banded doors that look capable of outlasting time itself. Inside, it smells like history, dust, mold, and the faint sweetness of old grain. The keeper, an elderly man with a beard resembling an untrimmed broom, greets you with a polite cough. He presents the inventory logs, each sheet marked with neat red stamps. Too neat, you think? Numbers that tidy always hide a corpse. You open one bundle of sacks and check inside. The rice is there, but mixed with pebbles, a farmer's favorite illusion of abundance. You make a note: quality inconsistent, possible adulteration. The keeper winces, bowing repeatedly. Just a few stones, honored clerk. For wait, tradition. You smile thinly. Tradition is a heavy thing indeed. Rain begins again, gentle this time. You can hear it drumming against the tiled roof as you count. Brush to parchment, bead to abacus, numbers rising like quiet prayers. You calculate the loss, roughly 5% short of expected. You sigh. 5% could feed a village or a magistrate's gambling habit for a month. Historians still argue whether such shortages were acts of local corruption or simply the entropy of a vast agrarian system. You suspect both are true. Corruption, after all, is just human nature audited by bureaucracy. By midday, your stomach growls like an offended official. You sit under the eaves, eating a bowl of congee that tastes like boiled arithmetic. Across the yard, two junior clerks argue whether ghosts can steal grain. One swears his ledger changed overnight. The other suggests sleep deprivation. You don't intervene. Both sound plausible. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Ming provinces performed grain purification rituals, where priests recited sutras to banish hungry spirits blamed for missing stores. The Empire of Reason still relied on a sprinkle of mysticism, accountability through exorcism. After lunch, you oversee the reweighing of tribute silk. The bundles shimmer in muted saffron light, each tied with a red cord like a festive corpse. Silk quotas always make you nervous, too valuable, too easily skimmed. You record the counts with extra care, your brush strokes deliberate, precise. The keeper offers you a bribe in the form of candied ginger. You accept it, purely to be polite, you tell yourself, and write all satisfactory in the margin. The day stretches long and thick. A small boy, the keeper's nephew, scampers between sacks chasing a grasshopper. You watch him for a moment and think of the absurd machinery you serve. How every tally, every signature, every stamp is meant to sustain not just order, but belief. The idea that the empire still knows where its food lives. When you finally seal the ledgers, your fingers ache. You carry the scrolls back through the muddy path, careful not to trip. The river glints bronze under the dying light. Barges drifting lazily toward the horizon. A group of porters passes, singing a work song about taxes turning into ghosts that follow you home. It's catchy. Back at the office, you deliver the ledgers to the magistrate, who listens with half an ear and a full teacup. 5% loss? He muses. Then let's report 4. You hesitate, then nod. Empires, like ledgers, survive by rounding down their sins. As night descends, the clerks pack up. The lamps burn low, their light flickering like nervous thoughts. You sit for a while longer, staring at the shelves of scrolls, each one breathing quietly in the dark. There's a comfort in the monotony, the idea that your small accuracy helps keep the world from tipping over. The empire may be vast, chaotic, absurd, but you've done your part. You counted. You wrote it down. And for tonight, that feels almost holy. You wake before dawn, when the air is still and the corridors echo like a cave of sighs. The bureau's lanterns sputter one by one as clerks shuffle in, rubbing sleep from their eyes. You join them, the rhythm automatic now. Unroll the sleeves, grind the ink, bow to the portraits of emperors who never touched a brush themselves. Today's docket: verification of household registers, a deceptively simple task that means endless scrolls of names, ages, and livestock counts. An empire of ink and conjecture. You find your place at the long wooden table, its surface scarred with centuries of arithmetic. The register is enormous, the parchment stiff, smelling faintly of glue and sweat. At the top of each entry, a neat square seal, bright red, like tiny drops of dried authority. You dip your brush and begin the slow, soothing dance of bureaucracy. You copy a name: Li Wei, age 47, 2 pigs, 3 sons. Then you check the tax owed in millet, the corresponding column for labor service, and the marginal notes from last year. 1 son missing, presumed draft. Presumed. Such an efficient word for loss. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ming taxation worked on a system called the Ligia, grouping 10 households into a collective unit responsible for each other's dues. It was genius in its cruelty. If one farmer failed to pay, his neighbors covered the debt. Mutual responsibility turned survival into a civic duty. You stretch your hand, your knuckles pop like firecrackers. The clerk beside you, a short man named Joe, mumbles something about ink demons that eat numbers overnight. Historians still argue whether that's superstition or metaphor, you joke, but Joe is not listening. He's counting the ghosts in the margins. By mid-morning, the magistrate himself glides in. His robes are the color of teal riverweed, his expression one of cultivated exhaustion. He offers the usual speech. The empire depends upon accuracy. You bow and think, accuracy, yes, but also obedience. The two often balance on the same brushstroke. Then comes inspection. A farmer is dragged before the desk, hat in hand, trembling. He insists his ox died before the tax day and that his grain tithes should be reduced. You check his register line. 1 ox, alive, healthy, reported last spring. Contradiction noted. You summon your practiced neutrality. An ox cannot die twice in 1 year, you say, as if quoting scripture. He pleads. The magistrate waves his fan, bored. Let the penalty stand, he murmurs. The guards pull the man away. You add a note. Adjustment denied. The words feel heavier than they should. Lunch is rice and salted fish again, eaten on the steps while the sun climbs lazily above the courtyard wall. You watch a sparrow hopping between discarded ledgers and think about escape. Not rebellion, not defiance, just the idea of standing somewhere without paperwork. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Ming clerks use secret poems as mnemonic devices to remember long columns of figures. 3 cranes fly over 4 ponds might mean 3,400 bushels. A single moon on 10 rivers meant 1/10 tax reduction. Poetry as accounting, romantic and ridiculous. After the meal, the room fills with the dry rasp of parchment. Dozens of brushes whisper across the tables in unison, like cicadas chanting bureaucracy into existence. You lose yourself in the rhythm, the repetition hypnotic. A courier bursts in with a sealed notice from the capital. Everyone stops. The wax bears the emblem of the Ministry of Revenue, a rare intrusion from the heart of empire. The magistrate opens it carefully, his face unreadable. Inspection audit next month, he says. Double the ledgers. Prepare duplicates. A collective groan ripples through the room. Duplicates mean twice the writing, half the sanity. Joe mutters that heaven itself keeps fewer records. You begin making clean copies, hands steady, breath shallow. The brushstroke becomes meditation. Down, curve, lift. Down, curve, lift. You think of the ox farmer, of the pebbled rice, of the long chain of minor injustices that keep the empire upright. Every signature, every seal, every denial, It all stacks like bricks in a wall nobody questions. The lamps are lit before you even notice the dusk creeping in. Shadows of clerks stretch across the walls like weary ghosts. A mosquito lands on your wrist. You let it feed. It's nice to feel useful to something. By the time the gong sounds to end the day, your mind is a blur of names and numbers. You close the register and seal it with wax, pressing the emblem gently. For a brief moment, you imagine each ledger line glowing, threads in an invisible net that holds the empire together. You're one knot among millions, tight but replaceable. Outside, the evening air is cool. You walk home through narrow alleys where vendors pack away baskets of chestnuts and lamps flicker in watery reflections. Someone plays a flute, the tune soft and meandering. You wonder whether the empire would collapse if everyone simply forgot to write tomorrow. The idea makes you smile, then yawn. Tomorrow, of course, you'll write again. The morning bell clangs again, one tone flat and resigned, like a cough that never healed. You open your eyes to the same ceiling beams, the same dripping corner where condensation forms its own tiny empire of mildew. Another day in the Bureau of Taxation. You stretch, counting vertebrae like abacus beads, and drag yourself to the courtyard before sunrise. The courtyard's flagstones glisten with dew, and someone's already sweeping. The young apprentice, thin as a bamboo reed. His broom makes small, disciplined arcs, scattering yesterday's dust into today's workload. Early start, you mutter. He nods solemnly. Early debt, sir. The boy already sounds like a bureaucrat. Inside, the scent of burnt ink fills the air. One of those sensory anchors of your life now, like bread for a baker or sea salt for a fisherman. The scribes have arrived early to prepare the monthly balance report. Today you're reconciling taxes paid in kind. Millet, silk, salt, and, for reasons no one quite remembers, bundles of dried fish from the coastal prefecture of Ningbo. Your mainstream historical fact: the Ming economy officially ran on silver by the mid-16th century, but many rural provinces still paid taxes in goods because coinage was scarce and transport expensive. So instead of neat ingots, the empire collected chaos: grain sacks split and open, silk damp from river crossings, salt cakes already half dissolved. You sigh at the inventory: 238 dan of millet, 6 bolts of silk, 4 barrels of salt, 1 crate of dried fish, and 1 crate, also labeled fish, that appears to be onions. The clerk beside you shrugs. Smells like both. The magistrate insists that every item be logged precisely, so the storeroom becomes a theater of exasperation. You and 3 others measure grain by candlelight, counting scoops while rats stage nightly uprisings. The apprentice reads off figures in a shaky voice. 50 sheng, 51 sheng, 52? You glare. Consistency is the heart of virtue. He nods, terrified, and promptly miscounts again. By mid-morning, the storeroom feels like a bakery for dust. You pause to stretch your legs, stepping outside where sunlight slices through the narrow court. A messenger gallops past, his uniform streaked with mud. He's carrying sealed orders from Nanjing, you're told. New tax reforms. Historians still argue whether these mid-century decrees simplified the tax system or merely confused everyone in new and creative ways. The emperor's advisors had promised clarity. What you got was an arithmetic riddle wrapped in politics. The single whip law, they called it, combining labor, land, and grain taxes into a single silver payment. Beautiful on paper, torture in practice. You try to explain it later to a farmer brought in for questioning. He stares blankly as you describe conversion rates. So many caddies of grain per ounce of silver, adjusted for region, minus the salt surcharge, divided by collective liability. Finally, he just says, "So, I owe you soup?" You envy his interpretation. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some local officials took creative accounting to wild extremes, inflating household numbers to meet quotas or, in rare cases, registering dead ancestors as active taxpayers. "The spirit realm pays on time," one joked in a surviving letter. No one laughed at audit season. Afternoon arrives heavy and humming. The scribes move like puppets wound too tight. Every quill scratch sounds like a sigh. You dab sweat with a sleeve, only to smear ink across your cheek. Joe notices and chuckles. "A new seal of office," he says. You threaten to report him for insubordination, then grin. Lunch is taken in silence. Cold rice and pickled radish eaten off ledgers because the table space is all paper. A fly lands on your chopstick. You salute it. It doesn't move. Then comes the dreaded reconciliation session. Representatives from the Treasury arrive with scales to weigh the grain shipments. They adjust the balance by blowing gently on the pans, a performance of precision. You whisper to Joe, "One more breath and they'll owe us half the province." But the magistrate watches with rapt attention, nodding gravely as though silver dust itself were falling from heaven. The results are recorded, sealed, and immediately disputed. Someone miscopied a number from Shy to Dan, multiplying the total tenfold. You watch as tempers rise like steam. The magistrate, fanning himself serenely, says, "Let heaven correct arithmetic through diligence," which means, of course, you'll correct it. You spend the next 3 hours recalculating columns until numbers lose meaning. By dusk, the ink on your page seems to crawl. Zeros turning to spirals, characters winking in and out at comprehension. The mind rebels against monotony, inventing its own hallucinations. You imagine the grain ledgers whispering secrets. "We were never counted. We never existed." A clerk faints from exhaustion, his brush falling neatly across the table. You help him up, pretending it's heroic labor, though you know it's dehydration and boredom conspiring. Outside, the sun dips behind the walls, painting them saffron and pink. The magistrate dismisses the staff with a magnanimous wave. "Rest well," he says. "Tomorrow we review arrears." A collective groan. Arrears mean confronting unpaid taxes stretching back decades, some owed by families long gone, others by officials politely pretending amnesia. You shuffle home through narrow lanes where peddlers shout the day's last bargains. The air smells of frying scallions and wood smoke. A musician plucks a pipa near the river. Its notes drip like honey into the evening air. At your lodging, you unroll your mat and stare at the ceiling again. You think about the single whip reforms, about the dead ancestors paying taxes, about the farmer who owed soup. You start laughing softly, the sound startling even to you. Joe from the next room taps the wall. "Either share the joke or sleep, friend." You answer, "Just practicing my optimism." You close your eyes. The laughter fades into that low hum of bureaucracy that never quite leaves you. The whisper of ledgers turning, quills scratching, the empire breathing through its paper lungs. The roosters haven't even considered crowing when you're already awake, listening to the echo of distant drums, the signal for tax collection day. You can almost feel the empire shifting on its massive spine as couriers, collectors, and clerks all begin to stir. This is not your favorite duty, It involves leaving the safety of ink and desks for the wild unpredictability of people. You meet the others in the courtyard. The magistrate, bundled in russet robes, gives the usual lecture about diligence and virtue. While you stifle a yawn big enough to offend heaven, the carts are loaded with ledgers, official seals, and 2 wooden chests for silver. Beside them, 4 guards adjust their spears with sleepy precision. The road out of town is muddy from last night's rain, but the morning light is kind, soft, golden, full of lies. Villages scatter across the hills like handfuls of clay pots. The air smells of damp earth and pine, and for a moment you feel almost free. Then the wagon hits a rut and your teeth clack together like abacus beads. Freedom rescinded, your mainstream historical fact. Ming tax collectors were required to travel from county to county twice a year to collect grain and silver dues. Their journeys were logged meticulously, with mileage calculations so strict that even bathroom stops were, in theory, timed. You suspect the inspectors who wrote that rule never once had to squat in a bamboo thicket. The first village greets you with wary hospitality. The headman bows too low, too long, always a bad sign. He ushers you into his hall, where incense burns thick enough to obscure the cracks in the walls. Tea is served, weak and polite. You nod gravely, pretending not to notice the way his hands tremble. "Has the silver been prepared?" you ask. He nods too quickly, signaling a boy to fetch a small coffer. Inside are coins dull with age, some clipped around the edges. "Remelted tax," you mutter. The headman insists the shortage is due to bandits. "Bandits are efficient accountants," Joe whispers behind you. You record the payment with ritual slowness, pressing your seal into wax that smells faintly of honey. The villagers watch as though witnessing an exorcism. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Ming tax officers, desperate to keep track of scattered payments, would stitch silver ingots into embroidered belts under their robes. This made them both secure and ridiculous. Imagine tripping and jingling like a walking treasury. Joe wears one now, and you can hear faint clinks every time he sneezes. Outside, children chase chickens between the carts while elders murmur blessings or curses. You can't tell which. The magistrate, already weary, fans himself. "We'll be lucky to finish this prefecture before frost," he sighs. The next village is poor. The rice fields shimmer but yield little. The peasants bring out baskets of millet as payment, but the moisture content is high, half rot by imperial standards. You measure the grain, then scratch a note. Accepted under protest. The villagers bow. You bow. Everyone knows the dance. Midday heat settles like a curse. You and Joe retreat under a camphor tree, sharing a flask of tepid water. "Remind me," he says, "why we didn't become monks." You answer, "Less paperwork here." You both laugh, then immediately cough on dust. A courier rides up, his horse foaming. He delivers a scroll sealed in vermilion, new quotas from the provincial treasury. The numbers are absurd, higher than last year despite poor harvests. The magistrate mutters, "Heaven tests loyalty through arithmetic." Joe mutters something less poetic. By afternoon, tempers fray. A farmer protests his levy, swearing his land was flooded. You inspect his register, no record of disaster. He gestures wildly toward the river, still swollen and muddy. You sigh, add a note, and reduce the grain due by 1 dan. Historians still argue whether compassion or consistency built the Ming, you say quietly. "Probably neither," Joe replies. Evening drapes over the fields. Smoke rises from cooking fires. mingling with the faint scent of soy and burnt straw. The magistrate orders camp to be made by the roadside. Guards set up tents while you tally the day's haul by lamplight. The silver clinks like rainfall. The ledgers whisper back in protest. You jot down the summary. 8 households delinquent, 3 partial payments, 1 disputed flood case. Each number feels like a pebble dropped into an invisible lake, the ripples reaching someone you'll never meet. After dinner, rice gruel and dried tofu, you sit outside listening to the frogs. Joe joins you, unrolling his belt to count silver under the stars. He mutters, "If heaven pays us by the moon, I'll retire tomorrow." Here's a second quirky bit, whispered across the empire. Tax collectors were said to attract fox spirits drawn to the jingling of coins. Some officers carried charms made of cinnabar ink, believing the spirits would protect their fortunes. You wear one too, though yours is really just a dried chili tied with string. It works, no foxes yet. As the night deepens, a cool wind brushes through the reeds. The guards doze. You stare at the ledgers stacked by the fire, small mountains of obligation glowing faintly amber. You think of the farmers' faces, the tremor in the headman's hand, the magistrate's perfumed fan fluttering above it all. You whisper to Joe, "Do you think the emperor knows what silver smells like?" He chuckles. "Heavenly incense, probably." The fire cracks, scattering embers into the dark. The frogs keep singing. The empire, vast and weary, turns another page in its endless book of debts. You lie back against a sack of grain, close your eyes, and for once the world feels almost kind. Soft air, steady crickets, distant laughter from the guards. Somewhere far away, thunder murmurs over the mountains. Tomorrow will be another collection, another ledger, another chance to measure life in ounces and size. You drift off thinking, maybe fox spirits would be better company after all. Dawn drips into the valley like pale ink poured across paper. You wake with the taste of ash on your tongue, the campfire long gone cold. The mist clings to your robes as you stretch, bones protesting every bureaucratic ambition you've ever had. Joe snores softly beside the silver chest, an image of loyalty if you squint hard enough. The magistrate's servant rings a small bronze bell, signaling another day of duties. You pack your brushes, blotters, and the endless scrolls that make up your life. A rooster crows late, clearly unmotivated. "I respect him," you mutter. Breakfast is simple: congee, pickled radish, and regret. The magistrate eats in silence, watching the horizon as if hoping it might yield an excuse to turn back. Instead, it yields a long road curling through low hills, each one holding a village, each village holding a new complaint. You travel through groves of cypress and bamboo, the air alive with cicadas whose chorus sounds suspiciously like laughter. "They mock us," Joe says. "They pay no tax." You reply, "If we could tax noise, the treasury would overflow." The first stop is a river settlement called Willow Bend, named for trees that have long since been chopped for firewood. The river is shallow now, revealing rocks slick with algae. Children wade barefoot, their laughter cutting through the heat. It's oddly comforting, proof that the empire hasn't yet taxed joy. Mainstream historical fact time. The Ming bureaucracy relied heavily on itinerant record keepers like you to ensure fair taxation, but fair was a fluid term. Local magistrates often balanced imperial expectations with human realities, revising quotas depending on flood, famine, or imperial mood swings. In practice, mercy was measured in margins. At Willow Bend, The tax ledgers are handled by a frail, stooped man with ink-stained fingers. He bows deeply, muttering apologies for the delay. His scrolls are damp, blotched with mildew, and smell faintly of despair. You unroll one and sigh. "Joe," you whisper, "it's like reading tea leaves after an earthquake. The numbers make no sense. Payments entered, erased, re-entered. The old clerk explains that bandits burned the storehouse last season, and he had to reconstruct the records from memory. Historians still argue whether Ming record-keeping was an art or a hallucination," you say dryly. Joe replies, "Clearly both." You spend hours recalculating. The villagers hover, watching your brush move across parchment with the reverence usually reserved for dragons or tax waivers. The magistrate finally stamps the new figures with his vermilion seal, leaving a small cloud of red dust in the air. By mid-afternoon, the sun roasts the earth into submission. The road ahead glimmers like molten glass. Joe, whose stamina decreases in direct proportion to humidity, mutters about becoming a monk again. You consider joining him, then remember monks live on donations. "Better the empire's appetite than a temple's bowl," you say. Your quirky tidbit: some Ming tax envoys carried portable inkstones carved into dragon shapes, believed to channel wisdom, or at least distract from boredom. Yours is simpler, a chipped rectangle that leaks when it rains. Still, you pat it affectionately. It's seen more of the world than most poets. The next village brings surprises. A local widow named Madame Lee insists on paying in kind. Woven silk instead of silver. She presents the bolts herself, hands steady, eyes sharp as any official's. "My husband died in the levee last year," she says. "The silk is all I have left to trade." You pause, considering the rules. Technically, payment in silk must be valued and converted into taels at a rate the treasury updates every leap year or whim. You glance at the magistrate, who sighs and nods. The silk gleams teal and gold, the weave fine enough to shame a court robe. You record the exchange, adding a note: "Compensation granted under hardship clause." The magistrate mutters, "You'll be broke in spirit before we reach the capital." You answer, "Better broke than petrified." As you finish tallying, Joe leans in. "Do you think heaven keeps ledgers like these?" You say, "If it does, we're all bankrupt." He laughs, and a dragonfly lands on his brush handle, shimmering green. For a moment, even the numbers seem kind. Evening slides down the hills, soft and golden. Smoke curls lazily from hearths, and you smell garlic frying in oil. Proof that the world still believes in small joys. The magistrate orders camp beside a mulberry grove. The guards string lanterns between trees, their glow catching the silver thread of spiderwebs. You sit apart, brushing your sleeves clean of dust. Across from you, Joe tries to balance the ledger on his knees. The pages flutter like tired birds. "It's funny," he says, "how our work makes everything look tidy on paper, even when it's chaos outside." You nod. That's the trick of empire, order by handwriting. As night deepens, you watch lightning flicker behind distant clouds. The sound of frogs begins again, a choir of bureaucratic approval. The magistrate hums a tune older than the dynasty itself, low and mournful. You pull your cloak tighter, thinking of all the lives pressed flat into ink. Farmers, widows, clerks, forgotten in neat columns of silver and grain. Somewhere in those numbers, the empire dreams of harmony. Somewhere else it dreams of profit. You wonder which dream wins. Before sleep, Joe mutters, "You know, my mother wanted me to be a musician." You smile. You still can. The abacus makes a fine percussion instrument. He snorts, tossing a twig into the fire. The embers pulse gently, reflecting in your inkstone like small suns. Tomorrow will bring more seals, more signatures, more quiet rebellions written in margin notes. But for now, the night is merciful. You listen as the frogs fall silent, one by one, and the first stars appear. Tiny ink drops on heaven's parchment. The empire, you think, is just another ledger, waiting for dawn to turn the page. You return to the county yamen just as the sky decides to imitate parchment. Flat, pale, slightly smudged at the edges. A courier's bell rings 3 clipped notes, and your stomach replies with a 4th. Today is audit day. The inspector from the prefecture arrives in a sedan chair that creaks like an overfull ledger, flanked by 2 assistants carrying boxes of brushes sharpened to moral points. Their robes are trimmed in vermilion, which feels less like fashion and more like a threat. He greets the magistrate with a bow calibrated to the grain of the floorboards, then turns to you, because fate loves a clerk. We shall begin with arrears and conversions, he says, the way a surgeon says, we shall begin with your kneecaps. You spread out months of ledgers, grain in kind, silver commutations, relief disbursements during the last flood. The inspector's eyes move in tiny, merciless arcs. Joe whispers behind you, breathe like paper, flat and steady. You try. Your lungs prefer panic. Mainstream historical fact, Ming administrations use vermilion annotations, zhupu, to mark corrections and reprimands on local accounts. And those little red notes could cascade upward into demotions, fines, or ritual humiliations. You've heard stories of clerks forced to stand through an entire audience holding an abacus like a penitential rosary. You hold your own abacus now and swear it gains weight when officials stare at it. The inspector dips his brush in cinnabar and draws a single line through your column for the hamlet of white bamboo. Explain this, he says, tapping where flood relief offset the tax quota. You recite the dates. River breach in the 5th month, fields ruined, 3-month remission granted per statute 13. He nods but doesn't smile. Auditors metabolize smiles into questions. Your yield estimate, he adds, seems optimistic. You present the measuring logs, those muddy days in the granary when you weighed tradition-rich sacks full of bonus pebbles. We adjusted quality downward, you say, pointing to your own faint marginalia. Stones declared citizens, taxed accordingly. The inspector almost smirks. Almost. He counters with the prefecture's model yield for comparable soils. You counter with the rat's model appetite. For a heartbeat, you and he are dueling with invisible swords made of math. Decimal, he says suddenly, tapping a subtotal. You have placed the dot too kindly. He's right. A harried evening, and a flick of the wrist slid a tail and a half into mercy. You feel the room tilt. Historians still argue whether Ming audits sought truth or obedience. You suspect the answer is yes. You take the brush, draw the dot back to its assigned fate, and add a note explaining manual tremor due to storm. The storm was real. The tremor, artistic. The assistants begin their side attack, the inventory cross-check. They unfold copperplate lists sent months earlier from the prefectural treasury, enchant item names like a ritual, sacks, bolts, beams, drums of vinegar for rations. Where are the vinegar drums, one asks. You recall the famine month when vinegar became medicine for bad water, sanctioned by a hurried seal and a sleepless you. You produce the order, signed and sticky with old rain. They study it as if vinegar could confess. Quirky tidbit. whispered by a former colleague. Some auditors sharpen their brushes by biting the hair tips, leaving faint cinnabar stains on their teeth. Fearsome smiles that look like they ate arithmetic for breakfast. You can't help glancing at the inspector's mouth. His teeth are polite porcelain. Good. One less nightmare tonight. Mid-morning stretches itself into an argument about conversions under the single-whip pilot rates here, grain there, labor somewhere no one has visited since the last emperor's haircut. You diagram with your brush on scrap paper. Shy to Dan, Sheng to tiles, tiles to Wen, then back to grain because the cart broke and silver did not arrive. Joe watches the map of misery grow. If you can draw it, he whispers, perhaps you can blame the picture. You resist the urge to label the diagram dragon. The inspector pauses at a page stamped emergency relief, famine remission. He taps a name, the oxless farmer you denied weeks ago. You feel heat on your ears. We later confirm the floodplain encroached farther than reported, you say. The inspector lifts an eyebrow. Later, you show the dated survey sketch, your lines shaky from standing in ankle-deep silt while the headman swore at heaven. The inspector reads quietly, then writes in vermilion. Remission upheld. Clerk's diligence noted. You release a breath you forgot you owned. Joke 1 lands in your mind and you keep it there. You'd embroider that line on a pillow if pillows were reimbursable. Lunch appears. Plain rice, slivered cucumber, tea the color of pale honesty. Everyone pretends it's a feast. The inspector eats with small, exact bites. You eat with large, defensive ones. Joe whispers, if he asks for more tea, bill the prefecture by the drop. You glare, then snort into your cup. After the pause, the red ink ballet resumes. Now they check seals, real cinnabar versus counterfeit. He holds one of your impressions to the light. The border is smudged, he says. Humid day, you reply. He nods. Humidity is the oldest accomplice. You decide you like him. A soul who blames weather will forgive mortal risks. Main hall murmurs swell as petitioners drift through. The office still trying to live while the audit dissects it. Somewhere behind the screen, a monk argues again for spiritual tax exemption. Today you envy him the clarity of impossible requests. The inspector hears none of it, lost in columns. Here, he says, finger landing on salt ticket revenue. Your values for permits sold to carriers differ by route. You explain the coastal discount to keep brine moving during storms. He considers. Historians still argue whether such local discretion strengthened the state or merely fattened footnotes. You file that debate under both, with a side of courage. Mid-afternoon fatigue turns numbers into river pebbles. Round, numerous, indifferent. The inspector asks to see the storehouse, and you lead him through the alleys, where cats own the thresholds and laundry speaks in silent flags. Inside the granary, the old keeper bows, beard trembling like a broom in a draft. You pry open a sack. White grains slide in a miniature landslide. The inspector dips 2 fingers, rubs, nods. Fewer stones than legend claims, he says. The keeper beams as though knighted. Back in the hall, the vermilion storm thins to drizzle. You field smaller strikes, a misbound bundle, a surname dropped 1 stroke short, changing sun to door. An abacus row skipped thanks to a sneeze that shook 5 columns. You correct each with quiet penance. Joke 2 arrives hushed. If sneezes are taxable, we're saved. Joe mouths hush, grinning. Near dusk, the inspector sets his brush down, hands red-flecked as a veteran of paper war. He composes the final note aloud, voice steady. Accounts largely in order. Losses attributable to flood and transport. Clerk exhibits caution. Magistrate urged to improve seal discipline. He stamps it with a square as decisive as a drumbeat. Your shoulders unknot so quickly you fear you'll float. As the assistants pack, the inspector lingers. You keep good margins, he says, eyes flicking to your modest annotations. The small hesitations, the tiny mercies. Empires are built there. You bow, half to him, half to the idea. He adds, almost conversationally, arithmetic is scarier than cavalry. Cavalry ends your day. Arithmetic questions your soul. You laugh, soft, surprised. Joke 3 files itself gently. You'll put that on a wall if anyone lets clerks have walls. He leaves with the twilight, sedan chair rocking like a satisfied ledger. The courtyard exhales. The magistrate strolls over, fan lazy, voice careful. We are acceptable? You show him the verdict. He nods, then, after a beat, seal discipline? You shrug. Humidity, he smiles. Always humidity. You sit alone at your desk as lamps are lit, each wick a tiny moon pasted to the rafters. The vermilion scratches on your pages glow like miniature wounds that have already scabbed. You think of the farmer's remission that survived, of vinegar drums that confessed and were forgiven, of decimals moved back to penance. Historians still argue whether the Ming survived on fear or habit. You fold today under a third category. Attention. Outside, a dog barks at a moth. In the lane, a hawker calls the last buns of the day, steam rising like soft equations. You close the ledger, press your seal, lighter this time, as if the wax knows it's been watched, and whisper, be boring, be true to the page. For once, the page whispers back, or maybe the night simply agrees. When you finally stand, your knees pop like abacus beads, counted, balanced, blessed by monotony. Somewhere the inspector is already a silhouette against the road, his red-tip brush drying into tomorrow. You blow out your lamp, carry the ledger to the shelf where uniform spines keep their secrets, and feel the rare, dull happiness of having survived arithmetic with your soul mostly intact. The day after the audit dawns with that particular stillness only found when an entire office is pretending nothing happened. You sit at your desk, savoring tea that tastes faintly of triumph and charcoal, and try to remember what it feels like to breathe without numbers judging you. For a moment, the yamen feels almost domestic, soft murmurs of clerks rethreading brushes, the slow shuffle of sandals over swept brick, a pigeon cooing from the roof beam as if to stamp the ledger of peace. But bureaucracy is a hydra that grows paperwork instead of heads. Before your tea cools, the magistrate steward glides in, face powdered with duty. A courier has arrived from the prefecture, he says, bearing forms. You blink. We sent them forms yesterday. He nods, pitying your naivete. They sent new ones today. And so it begins. Mainstream historical fact. Ming provincial governments routinely circulated fresh reporting templates even before previous versions had returned, an effort to standardize clarity that achieved the opposite. You unroll the courier's packet to find revised margins, new signature boxes, and a memo that politely apologizes for yesterday's instructions. Historians still argue whether this was incompetence or ritualized job security. Either way, your pen sighs louder than you do. By mid-morning, the office is a chorus of brushstrokes and suppressed groans. Each scribe is translating yesterday into today's slightly more official dialect. Joe hunches beside you, muttering, "They've added a column for optimism." You glance. Indeed, a new heading titled Projected Increase in Morale Among Taxpayers. You fill it with a single graceful zero and feel honest for the first time all week. To survive, you develop a rhythm. Grind ink, breathe, copy, joke, breathe again. The magistrate drifts in and out like an omen, pretending to supervise but clearly searching for somewhere less supervised. He offers faint encouragement. "We are instruments of order," then trips over a stool and becomes a metaphor. Outside, the sun burns politely through high haze. Couriers clatter past with bamboo cases, the empire's veins pulsing with correspondence. You remember that rumor? One unlucky clerk in Guangdong once misdelivered a memorial and spent the rest of his life counting rice shipments in exile. A small price for geography lessons, you suppose. Lunch brings relief in the form of pickled vegetables and gossip. Joe recounts how last night he dreamed of an abacus that whispered sedition. "It accused me of rounding down patriotism," he says. You assure him that loyalty, like decimals, is flexible. Quirky tidbit. Some Ming officials believe dreams about ink or accounting tools signaled impending promotion. A superstition you find both hopeful and dangerous. "Perhaps my abacus is simply ambitious," Joe muses, sipping his soup. Afternoon arrives draped in heat and politics. Two minor clerks argue over seating proximity to the magistrate's desk, which determines not importance but breeze access. You pretend neutrality, which in bureaucratic terms means winner. From beyond the screen, muffled voices rise. Visitors. A delegation of local gentry has come to discuss tax assessment fairness. Translation: complain. The magistrate greets them with the serenity of a man who has rehearsed apologies for every occasion. You take notes as he promises investigations, adjustments, harmony, celestial balance, phrases that fit every complaint and solve none. When the gentry depart, leaving behind the scent of expensive discontent, the magistrate leans close. "Remember," he whispers, "to record their visit as amicable." You nod, writing amicable, with faint thunder. The afternoon drifts into its petty politics phase. You catch the grain store supervisor slipping in to deliver a mysterious parcel, dried fish, wrapped in silk. "A gift," he murmurs, "token of gratitude for yesterday's fairness." You glance at the parcel, then at him. And gratitude, you say, is best expressed with a receipt. He laughs nervously. "No need." You hand him a quill. "Oh, but the empire insists." By the time he leaves, you've documented the transaction as perishable audit sample. Historians still argue whether Ming anti-corruption edicts curbed bribery or merely improved its paperwork. You think both sides would appreciate your creativity. Tea break again. Zhou practices diplomacy by complimenting everyone's handwriting. You realize that in this office, flattery is the only renewable resource. A senior scribe approaches, squints at your ledger, and nods approvingly. Your decimals align like soldiers. You beam. "Disciplined but underfed," you reply. Laughter trickles like ink down the room's tension. By late day, shadows stretch across the floor in precise bureaucratic rectangles. You review the new forms one last time. Each column polished, each seal obedient. For once, the arithmetic hums instead of screams. Joke one slips out as you seal the final sheet. "We should start taxing peace. It's clearly in short supply." Joe snorts, nearly spilling his ink. "Careful," he warns. "That's how religions start." Just as you pack up, the magistrate calls for a final review. You bring the neat bundle to his desk. He leafs through, murmuring approval until he reaches the morale column. "Zero?" he asks. Symbolic, you reply. He grins. Optimism, like taxes, grows best when underreported. You both laugh. A dangerous luxury, but one you'll risk. Outside, the sky bruises into evening. Clerks trickle out, their robes fluttering like exhausted flags. You linger a moment, savoring the faint rhythm of wooden tablets clicking shut, of quills tapping dry. The yamen feels different now, not merely oppressive, but weirdly human. As if all this monotony forms a heartbeat too slow for music, but steady enough for life. Walking home, you pass the paper market, stacks of blank scrolls awaiting destinies in ink. The vendor waves. Fresh pulp, very absorbent. You almost buy a roll just to smell potential, then remember your salary and settle for the scent of fried tofu instead. The night hums with small talk, crickets, and the occasional philosophical drunk arguing with a lantern. As you near your door, you realize that even the empire needs clerks to dream on its behalf. Perhaps that's what all this copying is, tiny prayers disguised as bureaucracy. Historians still argue whether the Ming's obsession with documentation preserved order or simply delayed chaos. You suspect that both answers share a single inkstone. At home, you light a single oil lamp. The glow paints your walls in gentle bureaucracy, shadows forming ledgers of their own. You lay out tomorrow's blank pages, smooth the fibers, whisper the day's final joke to the empty air. If heaven keeps accounts, may it use better ink. The lamp flickers, agreeing. And just before sleep folds over you, you think of the courier's forms still fluttering somewhere between prefectures. Proof that even in an empire of control, the wind remains the only honest auditor. Morning breaks like a polite intruder, soft, deliberate, carrying the faint smell of steamed buns and bureaucracy. You rise before the rooster has even decided whether crowing is worth the effort. Your room is small, but it has what every tax clerk secretly wants: predictability. The same chipped basin, the same bamboo mat that creaks like a confession, and a window that frames the same slice of pale sky as yesterday's sigh. You walk the alley to the yamen, sandals whispering against packed dirt. The dew has not yet surrendered to the sun, and your breath comes out in gentle clouds. At the gate, the guards nod. One yawns so widely it could count as attendance. You step into the courtyard, already alive with the shuffle of clerks carrying scrolls like reluctant monks with sacred burdens. The first duty today, conversion audit. Every tax district must reconcile its in-kind collections, grain, salt, cloth, into their silver equivalents for the provincial accounts. It sounds elegant on paper, but it means endless arithmetic and debates over exchange ratios that shift faster than magistrates' moods. Your desk greets you with an avalanche of ledgers, their bindings frayed from generations of predecessors. You unroll the first one, brush aside a stray hair, and read 200 bolts of hemp cloth, taxed at one tael per 10 bolts. Joe leans over your shoulder and mutters, assuming the cloth wasn't half moth. You sigh, assuming the tael isn't half rumor. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-Ming period, the single whip reform sought to simplify taxation by converting labor and goods into a uniform silver payment. On paper, it promised efficiency. In practice, it spawned 1,000 new ways to misunderstand a coin. Historians still argue whether it saved the treasury or merely standardized confusion. You make columns: cloth, grain, salt, livestock. The brush dances, half mindful, half mechanical. Around you, the chorus begins: the scratch of ink, the flutter of scrolls, the delicate cough of underpaid diligence. The air smells of paper dust and soy oil. Someone sneezes. Someone else swears softly about arithmetic that refuses to behave. Mid-morning brings the grain broker, a thin man with the serenity of someone always 2 lies ahead. He bows too low and produces a scroll that gleams with suspicious neatness. Revised figure from the southern storehouses, he says. You scan the numbers. The totals shimmer with optimism, an increase of 30% yield. Remarkable, you murmur. Given last season's floods, he smiles like a man caught by his own compliment. Nature can be generous. You dip your brush. So can prisons. He blanches. The magistrate chuckles from behind his screen. File it for verification, he says, which, as everyone knows, means pretend to believe it for now. Lunch arrives, steamed millet, pickled radish, and a rumor that the emperor has ordered a review of provincial corruption. Joe says, if they want evidence, they should just shake any yamen and see what falls out. You reply, probably us. He nods, serious. We're the heaviest items. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some clerks carried personal abacuses carved with auspicious phrases. Clear mind, full registers, believing that good fortune improved their calculations. Yours simply reads, don't die broke. You like its honesty. Afternoon bleeds into a contest of endurance. The magistrate dictates adjustments while you translate his philosophy into arithmetic. Fairness rounded to the nearest tail. You copy his edicts onto red-tinted paper, each one a miniature performance of authority. By imperial order, you write, though you know the emperor has never heard of your village or your ink. Still, it feels noble, as if you're polishing the empire's reflection 1 decimal at a time. The rhythm steadies you. Brush, blot, stamp, sigh. Occasionally a shaft of sunlight slips between roof beams, illuminating motes of dust that dance like free citizens. You envy them. Then disaster disguised as arithmetic. A miscopied column, 3 zeros adrift. Joe spots it first. You've just given that district enough surplus to buy heaven, he whispers. You stare, frozen. The ink still glistens, traitorous and wet. You could blot it, rewrite it, pray no one sees. But the magistrate's fan stops mid-wave. Something wrong? You confess. There's mercy and efficiency. Punishment takes less time than cover-up. The magistrate sighs. Correct it and record the correction. He pauses, softer now. Even the tax gods forgive once. You bow, relieved and humiliated in equal measure. Historians still argue whether Ming bureaucratic leniency reflected compassion or simple fatigue. You decide it's the latter. The afternoon limps toward dusk. Outside, carts rattle under sacks of rice bound for provincial depots. Each sack bears a red stamp, proof that you, somewhere in the ink labyrinth, exist. You imagine following those carts all the way to the coast, watching silver coins replace grain, watching numbers become nourishment. Then you remember your salary and return to arithmetic. The day ends with verification signatures. You and Joe double-check each other's seals. If the empire collapses, he says, I want our ledgers to survive as evidence. You laugh, a sound more honest than loyal. Stepping outside, you stretch under a sky smeared with late afternoon clouds. The wind carries a faint scent of roasted chestnuts from the market. The clerk in you begins calculating prices. The human in you decides not to care. For now, the empire balances, not perfectly, but enough to last until tomorrow's error. You walk home past the temple, where a monk sweeps the courtyard with rhythmic patience. You envy his simplicity, then realize he's probably calculating donations in his head. No one escapes arithmetic. Inside your room, you light the lamp, its flame trembling like an unpaid bill. You dip your brush one last time and write on a scrap of paper. All accounts settled except sleep. You smile at your own joke, though it isn't one really. The ink dries slowly. The city hums. Somewhere, far above the noise, the stars arrange themselves into an invisible abacus, counting your heartbeats with bureaucratic precision. Rain returns as paperwork with a grudge. It starts before dawn, a soft patter that pretends innocence, then swells into sheets that turn alleys into canals and roofs into opinions. By the time you reach the yamen, the magistrate stands under the eaves with a travel cloak and a face that says, "We're going out there." A runner arrives splashed to the eyebrows. A hamlet upriver, reed mouth, has been washed half sideways. You grab measuring rods, a waxed map, sealing clay, 2 brushes, and the ledger labeled Remissions in Extraordinary Circumstances, which has been lonely lately and therefore eager. Your cart groans up the road, wheels sulking in mud. The river is no longer a river. It's a rumor spread across fields, gleaming like a melted mirror. Water slaps at the axle. Your boots apply for transfer to a drier province. Joe braces the chest of forms with one knee and mutters that the flood should have booked an appointment. You agree, then immediately feel guilty, as if weather reads minutes. Reed mouth appears in fragments, roofs peaking like turtles, fences drifted into new philosophies. The communal threshing floor, now a pond, politely pretending to be helpful. Villagers gather on the one dry mound, faces gray with cold and calculation. Who lost what? Who owes what? Who hopes the ledger forgets their names? The headman bows, sodden hat in hand. "We measured the water with a pole," he says, "but the pole learned to swim." You smile despite yourself and ask for the old records. Acreage per household, last season's grain, livestock counts, everything that lets numbers pretend they're merciful. But here's your mainstream historical fact. Ming policy allowed tanbo, tax remissions, and grain relief from ever-normal granaries after floods, droughts, or pests. Magistrates surveyed damage, reported up the chain, and, if approved, opened storehouses and reduced quotas so villages could recover without collapsing or rebelling. In theory, it's mathematics wearing compassion's robe. In practice, compassion must pass inspection. You weighed the outskirts with a bamboo gauge painted in red sheng marks. Joe logs depths while you mark each household boundary on the waxed map. Lee family courtyard, 1 chi under. Chen patties, 2 chi and a sulking duck. The North Dike, overtopped and now roughly in the south. You sketch quickly, ink beading on wax, drawing the flood's handwriting across the valley. The magistrate trails cloaked and meditative, occasionally poking a beam with his fan as if authority might teach it buoyancy. Quirky tidbit from the headman. Every year their Dragon King shrine floats paper boats downriver on the first summer storm, each boat carrying a tiny paper tax receipt to ask the waters to accept those accounts instead of the villages. "The river is a meticulous clerk," he says gravely. "It files everything." Today you see blank boats stuck in reeds, little white pleas refusing to proceed. Work begins with a triage of definitions. What counts as destroyed? What counts as merely soggy? You mark a household uninhabitable when the threshold stones have migrated, damaged when chickens roost on roof beams like auditors. Joe reads totals aloud as if soothing a restless ox. Acreage submerged, cattle missing, granaries compromised. The villagers lean in on every number, as if each digit contains a dry blanket. You convene under a half-dry awning. The magistrate unwraps the remission ledger. Rain ticks against the bamboo like 1,000 impatient officials. We'll apply the 2/5 reduction for submerged patties, he says, and a full year's relief on corvée for households with structural loss. You translate this into strokes on paper, the brush steady even as your toes forget warmth. Historians still argue whether such remissions were genuine mercy or regime maintenance, relief as loyalty investment. But out here, the debate shrinks to a single bowl of rice that doesn't have to be paid away. A widow approaches, carrying a basket of sodden seed. "I have no ox," she says simply, "and the field is mud soup." You check her register line. Yes. The oxless widow from months back. The magistrate glances at you. You nod. Remit next season's land levy, grant seed from the granary, and register labor assistance from the Legia. The headman flinches at that last part but bows. Mutual responsibility tastes better in edicts than in schedules. Midday, the rain eases into interrogation. You and Joe eat cold millet under the cart, watching steam rise from the fields in tired tendrils. Joke one surfaces, uninvited. You suggest taxing the flood by volume. Joe pencils, "Good luck" in the margin. You remember the vinegar drums you once repurposed for bad water and wonder if Reed Mouth's well needs the same sour medicine. You add a note, request vinegar cask, cite prior order. Bureaucracy loves a citation, even when it smells like pickles. You spend the afternoon like a surveyor priest. Measure, mark, mutter, bless with arithmetic. The map fattens with symbols. Broken dike icon here. Granary dampness hash there. Households in need small circles with dots like seeds. You promise to bribe the map with a neat border if it behaves. It does mostly. By late day, the sun threatens to return, a pale coin pressed uncertainly against the clouds. You call the villagers to the headman's mound and read the preliminary remission schedule. Reductions by parcel, delivery of relief grain tomorrow, corvée exemptions noted in crimson, because nothing says compassion like vermilion. Murmurs ripple outward, relief, skepticism, gratitude, more skepticism. A boy asks if the ledger can stop the rain. You tell him the ledger is good with numbers, not with weather. He looks disappointed, and you quietly agree. The magistrate drafts the memorial to the prefecture on oiled paper while you prepare duplicates that won't melt if an official sneezes too enthusiastically. You affix seals with care, the wax stubborn in the damp. The headman watches your hands. "That seal feeds us," he says. The weight of that sentence makes the wax feel heavier than cinnabar. As you walk the hamlet one last time, you pass a wall where someone has carved a thin notch, a flood mark from a year you don't remember. Today's water has climbed past it by a finger's width. You draw the new line with your knife, date it, and press a tiny seal. Joe squints. "Every empire keeps time differently," and he says, "This one uses stains." You answer, "And maps that smell like rain." On the way back, the cart rattles with sacks of relief grain borrowed from a nearby storehouse, their stamps still wet. The sky bruises purple. Villagers meet you on the road with poles to lift the sacks high, a small procession of rescue disguised as logistics. A girl offers you a reed whistle as thanks. It makes a sound like a patient kettle. You tuck it into your sleeve, an unofficial receipt for hope. Evening settles on the yamen like a sensible blanket. You unroll the map to dry over a brazier. the wax sheen dulling to a workman's mat. Columns are cross-footed, signatures aligned, decimals domesticated. The magistrate peers over your shoulder. "You rounded the remission down?" he asks softly. You point at the margin note. "Future seed grant," rounds it back up. He nods, satisfied with the arithmetic of kindness. You write the day's summary in a calm hand. Flood depth measures, households affected, remissions granted under statute, grain dispersed, vinegar requested. It reads almost boring, which is how mercy should read in an archive. Quiet, procedural, inevitable. You add one line you've never written before. Disaster map appended. Sea seals along dike breach. It feels good to say the map exists, that the flood can be folded and filed, and then, someday, read by someone who smells only paper, not wet wood and anxiety. Night winds carry the river's softer voice back to town. You close the remission ledger and rest your palm on its cover, warm from the brazier. Joke 2 arrives as a yawn. If heaven audits compassion, may it note your margins. Joe leans in, eyes red but bright. "Remember when Pebbled Rice tried to pass as citizens?" he says. "Today, the river tried to pay too." You smile. "We gave it remissions instead." Before sleep, you step outside to the threshold, where the rain has reduced to silver threads. Lanterns reflect in puddles, making constellations underfoot. You imagine the Dragon King's paper boats finally slipping free, carrying tiny receipts down to an ocean that never reads them. Historians still argue whether maps and memos change anything beyond the ink. You decide they change people, and people change the rest. Back at your desk, you roll the reed whistle between your fingers and breathe a soft note. The office hums in sympathy, ledgers quietly agreeing. Mercy logged, map sealed, flood dated. For once, numbers feel like hands. The remission maps dry overnight into something almost artful. Thin veins of ink meandering like tame rivers across pale parchment. When morning light slants through the shutters, it catches the wax seals and makes them glimmer, tiny red suns orbiting your handiwork. You allow yourself the smallest luxury imaginable, one extra blink before rising. Today begins not with rain nor inspections, but with the quiet arithmetic of evening reconciliation, stretched forward into dawn. The Yaman clerk from accounting, nicknamed Old Ledger even though he's younger than you, has summoned everyone to the hall. "Final tallies," he croaks, as if announcing an execution. You sit cross-legged amid towers of ledgers, the smell of ash ink and sesame oil thick as memory. Each column of figures has its own personality. Arrogant sums, humble deficits, audacious rounding errors. You dip your brush, draw a careful line, and feel the tension ease in your shoulders as the numerals behave. Mainstream historical fact. The Ming bureaucracy demanded jiaocha, cross-verification of every figure by multiple clerks. 3 tallies per account, yours, the secondary scribes, and the magistrate's copy, had to match exactly or fines followed. Arithmetic wasn't just math, it was morality written in ink. You glance up to see the magistrate nodding approval. "A virtuous line," he says, "straight and honest." You suppress a laugh. It's a line, not a confession. But still, the compliment warms you like tea. Outside, mule carts grind by carrying sealed grain sacks marked with reed symbols. Joe checks the weights, humming the same lullaby you heard him mumble during floods. "This one's heavier than truth," he says. You scrawl reweigh in the margin and remind him truth comes in varying densities. Around noon, the rhythm deepens. Brush stroke, abacus click, seal press, sigh. The hall sounds like polite rain. The magistrate dictates closing remarks for the quarter's memorial, phrases about harmony restored, revenue balanced, heaven appeased. You transcribe dutifully, knowing full well heaven's bureaucracy is worse than yours. Quirky tidbit for the hour. A superstition among Ming clerks claimed that spilling ink on final accounts summoned ghosts of unpaid taxes. To placate them, one left a small brush rest shaped like a mountain, symbolizing stability. You, never superstitious but always thorough, adjust your brush rest just in case. Then the inspector arrives. Not the terrifying central envoy of your nightmares, but as local deputy, slim, perfumed, armed with vermilion ink. He flips through your ledgers, sniffing for mistakes as if they're aromatic. He frowns at one page. You feel your stomach perform interpretive dance. This subtotal, he says, doesn't align with your grain delivery receipt. You point gently. Delivery from Reed Mouth was offset under flood remission. See margin note. He reads, lips pursed, then nods. Ah, flood mercy always distorts elegance. Historians still argue whether the Ming obsession with flawless accounting strengthened governance or merely created performance art for frightened clerks. You lean toward the latter, especially when the inspector stamps his seal with theatrical flourish and declares, balanced. Afternoon melts into the golden haze of completion. Joe lights the first lantern. The flame flutters like a satisfied sigh. One by one, your colleagues close their ledgers, stack them into neat pyramids, and bow to the magistrate. He stands, rubs his temples, and says, Gentlemen, today arithmetic has saved civilization again. You can't help muttering, until next month. Joe hears you and grins. At least civilization pays overtime, he whispers. The magistrate dismisses the room. You linger, smoothing one last page until it shines like silk. For all its monotony, the symmetry soothes you. Columns marching like soldiers, stamps like constellations, order coaxed from chaos. Outside, night smells of bean curd and smoke. You follow the lanterns strung along the yamen wall, each halo a small sun guarding the empire's paperwork. At the gate, a beggar hums a familiar tune, the same flood hymn the villagers sang weeks ago. You drop a copper coin into his bowl and realize it's the most spontaneous thing you've done all season. When you reach your quarters, Joe's already there, crouched over a clay stove, coaxing flame. He's improvised dinner, thin rice gruel with a hint of ginger. Fuel's ration, he explains, but I bribed the stove with poetry. You laugh until the bowl trembles in your hand. You eat in comfortable silence. The wind outside carries the faint rhythm of temple bells and dogs, arguing about philosophy. Somewhere beyond the walls, farmers finish threshing the rescued harvest, owing a little less than yesterday. Joke one lands easily. You tell Joe the inspector's perfume could probably be used as tax collateral. He nearly chokes on his porridge. Later, you both examine the final balance sheet pinned to the post. Columns of neat characters under the heading, Peaceful Accounts, 9th month. It's beautiful in its own bureaucratic way, a ledger that hums rather than shouts. Strange, Joe says softly, how paper can look alive. Because we bleed on it, you reply, then regret the drama but let it stand. As you douse the lamp, the glow lingers on the parchment longer than physics allows. Maybe the ghosts of unpaid taxes appreciate a well-kept record after all. In the courtyard, frogs chant in uneven meter. The sky stretches velvet and infinite. You realize the numbers, the stamps, the petty audits. They're not prisons, but scaffolds, fragile attempts to hold an empire steady against the flood. You whisper a small benediction to no one in particular. May tomorrow's columns align. And for once, the night doesn't argue. Dawn crawls across the tiles like a patient clerk. Quiet, thorough, determined to check every shadow for errors. You wake before the rooster, though not by choice. A mouse has decided that your ledger makes an excellent highway. It skitters across the parchment, leaving tiny footprints that resemble quotation marks. You sigh and whisper, "Even vermin annotate my life." Joe's voice drifts in from the corridor. "Up already? The empire must still exist." You grunt in response, rubbing your temples. Sleep never lasts long after closing day. Your mind replays sums like lullabies sung by anxious accountants. The morning has that peculiar clarity after chaos. The flood season's done, the remission sent, the inspector satisfied. For once, the office yard looks clean. No carts, no queues of farmers holding petitions. No magistrate pacing like an unpaid ghost. Just stillness, pale and wide. You brew tea from last year's brick, bitter enough to sharpen memories. Its steam curls upward, tracing the same path as yesterday's ink. You stare at it and think how both tea and ink stain everything they touch. Mainstream historical fact. During the late Ming, local Yamen officials like you handled enormous workloads. Each county recorded over 20 categories of taxes, from grain and salt to cloth, paper, and even carpentry labor owed to the state. A good clerk was part accountant, part priest. A mistake wasn't simply wrong, it offended the moral order. By mid-morning, you and Joe walk the outer walls, checking for cracks left by last week's rain. Villagers have begun to bring offerings to the temple again. Incense, melons, even a rooster so proud it looks insulted by its own fate. The smell of roasted soy fills the lanes. Life, having briefly remembered its mortality, returns to gossip. You pause at the granary, running your hand along the cool bricks. Inside, the grain glows faintly in shafts of dust-heavy sunlight. "Look at that," Joe says. "We've turned chaos into porridge." You nod. It's not poetry, but it's accurate. A new proclamation arrives from the prefecture, written on silk, tied with yellow cord, still wet from the seal. The courier bows so deeply you fear for his spine. The message? Next quarter's quotas have been increased. Naturally, the magistrate reads it aloud in tones of mild despair. "Heaven's blessings are heavy this year," he mutters, "and so are the taxes." You and Joe exchange looks that say everything. No rest for the righteous, or for the numerate. Quirky tidbit. One Ming proverb claimed, "The emperor knows the name of every grain of rice, but none of the men who count them." It was meant as comfort, but it sounds more like cosmic irony. After lunch, a delegation of farmers arrives with gifts, 2 baskets of oranges, a jar of honey, and a poem so earnest it limps. "For your fairness," the headman says. The magistrate beams. "Fairness is expensive," he jokes, "but occasionally affordable." Everyone laughs, though you all know fairness has a short shelf life. Later, you help Joe file the season's receipts into long bamboo tubes that clack softly like wind chimes when handled. The sound is strangely soothing, a bureaucratic lullaby. Historians still argue whether our empire lasted because of men like us or in spite of them, Joe muses. "Maybe both, you reply. Afternoon light turns the courtyard gold. The walls seem less stern, the ledgers less heavy. You sit by the pond and watch dragonflies trace invisible tax codes across the water. "No errors in that system," you mutter. Zhou joins you with 2 small cups of rice wine, contraband but traditional after closing season. To arithmetic, he toasts. To arithmetic, you echo, and to mercy disguised as balance. You drink slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through your chest. For the first time in months, no one calls your name, no seal cracks, no deadline waits like a tiger behind the door. Just wind, wine, and the quiet hum of an empire between crises. As dusk gathers, you head to the record room one last time. Rows of bound ledgers line the shelves, each stamped, dated and heavy with collective sighs. You run a finger across the spine of the newest one. Flood remission, 9th month, year of the ram. Beneath the dust, the paper feels alive. You imagine some future scholar, sleep-deprived, spectacled, half-mad, reading your neat columns centuries from now. Maybe they'll call it diligence, maybe futility. Either way, the ink will speak. You blow out the lamps and the hall exhales with you. Outside, the moon hoists itself above the granary roof, round, bureaucratic, impartial. Its light silver coats the courtyard, the records, the unending empire. You and Zhou linger beneath it, 2 minor officials sharing a major piece. Strange, Zhou murmurs, how order feels almost holy at night. Only because no one's awake to break it, you answer, and he laughs softly. The crickets resume their committee meeting somewhere beyond the river. A dog debates philosophy with an echo. You close your eyes and breathe in the faint sweetness of the granary air, dusted with rice, ink, and possibility. Tomorrow another dispatch will come, another policy will arrive dressed as revelation, and the empire will resume its endless paperwork dance. But tonight, you let yourself believe in balance. Not the arithmetic kind, but the human kind. You whisper a private note to the wind, accounts settled. And for once, the wind agrees. The night deepens, folding softly around the yamen like a closing ledger. The crickets quiet, the lanterns dim. You can almost feel the ink cooling on every page, drying into permanence. In the distance, a temple bell tolls once, low, measured, final, like the last stroke of a brush completing the season's sum. Breathe. The air smells faintly of soot and sesame, of parchment and rest. You've survived floods, audits, and that one terrifying inspector who smelled like chrysanthemums. The empire turns without you for a while. Let it. Your heartbeat slows to match the rhythm of the abacus beads still swinging faintly in the dark. You remember the villagers' laughter after the remission was announced, the steam rising from Zhou's humble porridge, the moon glinting off wax seals. The world, even wrapped in paperwork, was never cold. Now imagine the ledgers gently closing, each page resting against the next like tired hands folding in prayer. The candle beside you flickers, then steadies. Its light softens the edges of the room, the same way memory softens history. Outside, the wind carries a single note of music, maybe a reed flute, maybe just air through bamboo, but it's enough to promise morning. You sink into stillness, feeling the ink of your own thoughts settle. The empire can wait. The taxes can wait. The world for once owes you nothing. Sleep, clerk of the Middle Kingdom. The books are balanced. The moon is kind. And all accounts, earthly and celestial, are closed for the night. Good night.